Israel violates a ceasefire. And one of the first mass atrocities it's committing is ambushing a convoy of ambulances and other first responder vehicles, massacring those workers, unarmed, clearly marked medics, shooting them, as we have discovered through the investigation, at point blank, executing them, just literally standing above them and shooting them, and then burying the bodies and the vehicles under earth, right? So the earth here becomes a mode of negation, right? Changing the earth is breaking the memory, the relation between society and space, raising that, what I call in the book, the earth storm. Earth waves kind of like crash over those bodies and vehicles, becomes a means of genocide denial.
Do Your Own Research is a show about the systems that make modern life possible. But that means it's also a show about the systems of modern killing and modern dying. And what we call a system of organised mass killing, we call it a genocide. The people of Gaza may be in what is technically called a ceasefire, but that doesn't mean the genocide has stopped. The guns and the planes may be killing fewer people for the time being, but the bulldozers are still roaring, tearing up the houses, fields, roads, schools, mosques, hospitals that make life in the Gaza Strip possible at all. They're trying to destroy the conditions of life and destroy the memory that there even was a Palestinian society there at all. This is exactly what is described in the Genocide Convention, imposing conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of a group. This is exactly what is described in the Genocide Convention, conditions of life imposed to bring about the physical destruction of a group. So to understand the system of death that continues even into the ceasefire, I'm talking to Eyal Weizman, author of Ungrounding, the Architecture of Genocide, which goes back 100 years into the history of Palestine to understand the systems of life and the systems of colonial domination that have attempted to snuff it out. Eyal is also the founder and director of Forensic Architecture, a research agency at Goldsmiths, University of London. What that agency does is assemble 3D models meticulously of war crimes, of atrocities. They build them out of all the traces of an event, from the shaky phone camera footage to the situated testimony of a survivor, to every documented piece of shrapnel, and use that to build a single coherent model. These reconstructions of events are so meticulously done that they have been used in evidence in court, and forensic architecture is a part of South Africa's submission against Israel at the International Court of Justice. I'll be showing some of that research on the screen as we get to it. But how do they continue this work of documenting an atrocity, a war crime, even a genocide, when the system of killing has not just been directed towards individual people, but towards the whole environment in a way that erases the traces of the life that was there before? Bury a people and then bury the evidence that you have buried them. This show connects to a few previous ones. Luke Kemp, in particular, and my discussion with him of the notion of applied collapse, how societies are deliberately destroyed, and my discussion with Alfred McCoy of the Vietnam War, where tunnels were such a major part of the resistance. And if you want to explore those connections in depth, and I know you do, you can find the full map on the Novara Media website. Link is in the show notes below and probably in a pinned comment. Eyal Weizman, welcome to Do Your Own Research.
Oh, happy to be here.
I want to start with where we are right now. We are 8 months into a supposed ceasefire in the Gaza genocide. What is happening right now on the ground? What are conditions of life? What are conditions of survival? And what is Israel doing in that re-articulated, changed zone of the Gaza Strip to erase conditions of life?
Right now, the survivors of the genocide, the Palestinians in Gaza, just under 2 million people are living on the sand dunes in the west part of Gaza, in about 40% of the area of the strip. That area is continuously being shrunk, and the Israeli military and the prime minister want to shrink it even further to increase the pressure on it. All conditions of life, and we'll speak about conditions of life, have been dismantled. That is to say, there is no agriculture in Gaza. There is no wild stock in Gaza. There is, in and amongst the ruins of the coastal cities, from Gaza to Deir al-Balah to the western part of Han Yunis, you have people living in and amongst the ruins, inhabiting in an incredibly dystopian way the ruins that used to be their homes, their multi-storied homes. In between and around them, there are tens and tens of thousands of tents in which people are crowded. Israelis denying the entry of chemicals necessary to control the different pest infestation. When we speak to people inside, to friends who are still inside, we heard about an incredible rat epidemic. Rats are everywhere in the tents. We have just moved from a very difficult winter with actually quite a lot of rain for that area that has flooded the areas of the tent. When rain is coming, the remaining sewage facilities are overflowing, and you have this kind of murky, sewage watery kind of sort of muck that is flowing in and out of those tents, flooding everything. People are dying out of hypothermia and infection, and out of things that in any other normal circumstances, contemporary cities with all their infrastructure are able to contain. But people are also just, maintaining being alive, learning, studying. Schools, primary schools, universities exist more as notions than as institutions. They exist in the relation between people. People are the infrastructure of resistance, the relation, family relations, social relations, political relations in Gaza are actually maintaining a kind of a life despite everything. Everything that is posed on Gaza, these conditions are not a kind of status quo. They're not like, a ceasefire that has frozen some kind of situation. Israel still bombs into it. It has assassinated the two last leaders of the Azadin al-Qassam, the Palestinian, the Hamas military wing and resistance leadership there. It is an attempt to slowly and in a controlled way, like in some kind of Milgram experiment, turn up hardship. So this is not a static situation. It's a situation in which time, denial amplify each other, and in which the space itself becomes a mechanism that is designed to eject the population out of Gaza. Now, there is nowhere to go. The border is closed. But with first opportunity, Israel would again attempt to push Palestinians out. So, it is a siege that is so much more horrific than the siege that have been put on Gaza in the past 20 years that led to the October 7th attack, in which Israel counts, every calorie and every, watt of electricity, megawatt of electricity and a liter of petrol to calibrate life and to calibrate use conditions of life as means of control, as attempted expulsion.
I want to go back to that phrase that you used there, or a phrase very close to it, conditions of life calculated, which is a phrase that comes from the Genocide Convention, which is to say, we are talking here about the conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part of a group of people. It seems like these are the conditions that are being imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip as you're describing them. Although there is a kind of sense that people wish to say, well, the ceasefire is now in place, now the genocide, even if and obviously there's lots of denial about genocide from the Israeli side, and indeed from the international community, so to speak. But what you're describing there seems to very accurately be exactly those kind of conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction in whole or in part of a group. Are we still in the midst of genocide, or is there a demarcation that we can make where the shooting stops and the kind of the slow misery begins?
No, you're absolutely right. So Raphael Lemkin understood when he was actually in the mid-40s writing the book Axis Rule, where he developed the concept of genocide. He goes through historical genocides, and a lot of his emphasis in understanding what it is, that crime, trying to define what is the crime that erases entire peoples, groups, cultures. He speaks about settler colonialism, and he understands the settler colonization of the Americas particularly, but not only, also in Africa, in other places, as a slower process of destruction that is conceived not only, of course, every settler colonial genocide has instances of mass murder, of mass violence, where villages are tortured and destroyed, forests are burned, where people are shot into mass graves. But he understands the slower process by which the environment itself is conceived as a mechanism of destruction. And to a certain extent, he makes a connection between the way in which indigenous peoples in the America were actually starved out by being dislocated out of their territories where they hunt or fish or live in a particular environment in a forest, into barren and badlands, and slowly their numbers kind of fall and disintegrate. And he makes, and this sometimes is a kind of a slow motion genocide that happens over decades, if not centuries, where epidemics and malnutrition are kind of like acting to destroy life. And he sees it also, and he combines it also with the kind of modern aspect. So the colonial is connected in the Second World War with the modern aspect of genocide, a environment of destruction, the concentration camp, the ghetto, the extermination camp. These are instruments of death that are designed by architects to accelerate those principles that in the colonial world took centuries. Now they would take years, days, etc. It's important to understand that when Lemkin is writing, and all the way to when it's ratified, so there's a few years between him coming out in a country, actually quite fast. No, I mean he's writing the book. The book is published in 1944. In 1948, the Genocide Convention is ratified. During that time, the conception of architecture, when people are thinking about architecture, people think about modern architecture. They think mainly about those ideas of the Bauhaus and Corbusier that were conceived just before the Second World War, in which cities and architecture become instruments to enhance life. That is basically what modernism is. A building is a machine for living in. A city is a kind of a machine for producing societies in enhancing the life of societies. A city is designed and separated its industrial parts from its parks and homes and commercial areas, designed in order to enhance the life of a population. Just like the house, the flat itself, think about those kind of like all the efficiency indicators of what's called the Frankfurt kitchen that is designed to produce the nutrition for a family. The privacy where the bedroom is located is designed to enhance reproduction of the family. Architecture is is conceived as a life-enhancing force. In the Second World War, those same architects that were trained in the Bauhaus and in other places that are kind of like everywhere in the Nazi administration now, are using similar principles in order to end life. No? So the minute you conceive architecture and space or the environment in relation to life, the minute that you create that equation, you can either amplify life or you can extinguish life with it. And the ghettos were kind of like, let's say, a slower form of destruction through starvation, through the denial of conditions of life, whereas the camp accelerated these conditions of destruction all the way to the extermination camp. And the image that you show here is obviously the gate of Auschwitz, and leading into Birkenau. And crematorium 2, which is probably the 200 square meter where most people died on. But here again, you have a relationship between the environment, the air that you breathe in a gas chamber, and life. No, there's always that relationship between space, environment, and life. And Lemkin understood that, and that is why that clause in the Genocide Convention, which speaks also about other things, under the special intent, it obviously prohibits the organized killing of society and wounding. It prohibits the attack on the reproductive capacity of society. But in that clause, what's called Clause 2C, it is really about the relation between space, environment, and life itself. And that became the most important hinge to understand the Gaza genocide, and indeed the process of settler colonialism, of which it is just a kind of an eruption. It sits very much on that line, because, as I guess we'll speak later through the book, the conception, there is two separate conceptions of environment in the indigenous one, in which it's a life world, and the settler colonial one, in which it is a kind of an instrument. No? So, for modern agricultural practice, such as that employed by settler colonialism during the Green Revolution of the post-Nakba era, or the post-48 era of the Nakba, the environment is conceived as a production site that needs to be amplified. No, the kind of environment, the kind of plants, the kind of fertilizers is all about amplifying. Even though you reduce the quality of the nutritional aspect of plants, you amplify production, you sell, you create it into a certain industrialized logic. But also from the beginning, settler colonialists kind of like amplified agricultural production for the colonizers and tried to destroy the life-giving force of the environment for the indigenous people. That is very much from the beginning. And to do that, you need to understand the environment in a kind of almost mechanical way, like you understand architecture. It's rests on soil, it's different soil type, more or less fertile. There's topography, there's high mountain, there's valleys, which tend to be more fertile than the top of the hills. There are water bodies on the surface, and under the surface there is there's the air and its moisture and humidity and direction and meteorology, and all that works together as a kind of environmental machine in relation to which one needs, or the settler colonial project taps into the logic of that environment in order precisely to extinguish one type of life and amplify another. So when you speak about conditions of life, I want us always to remember that it's a kind of like a tap. No, you can amplify just like the siege. No, you can bring in more when they count calories. You can bring in more calories or less calories. You can take the heat up or heat down, and in that way try to control the population inside through the environmental conditions that are imposed on them.
And so we have this sort of, if I was just going to very poorly summarize sort of the core idea there, we have this kind of split between the ways in which conditions of life calculated, this modernist project becomes, on the one hand, the project of constructing the rational architecture that people need in order to live, and on the other hand, producing zones of death in which people are extinguished, their lives are, and their systems of living, their forms of life are rendered impossible. Part of the, I think, resistance to Israel's own acceptance that what it is doing in Gaza is a genocide is not only because, of course, it's difficult to accept that you are committing genocide, but also because it doesn't look like this archetypal form of genocide. It doesn't look like Auschwitz-Birkenau. It doesn't have this sort of bureaucratic construction. This is, of course, Germany's most famous and largest genocide of the 20th century, but it's not Germany's only genocide of the 20th century. The Herero and Nama peoples were also genocided by Germany earlier in the 20th century. And I wonder if we can say that in the history of genocides, in the history of the subtitle of your book, The Architecture of Genocide, is the Holocaust atypical and therefore sort of serves to kind of mislead us when we're thinking about what the architecture of genocide is? Or is it simply a different form of that more rational or bureaucratized genocide that we don't see as the dominant form of genocide through history?
Yeah, I think it's probably a right way to think about genocide as having different speeds and intensities. And I think that even with in Lemkin's conception, it is the settler colonial genocides in the Americas that provide the archetype to it. But in fact, he's thinking about multiple other atrocities, not only the German imperial Germany genocide of the Nama and Herero people in Southwest Africa, today Namibia, but also the destruction of the Armenians in the context of the First World War, where indeed the desert in both those, in both the Gaza genocide, the Armenian genocide, and the Nama and Herero genocide, the desert function as a mechanism of destruction. I mean, think about the Armenians mainly from Eastern Turkey, expelled, of course, mass atrocities, of course, villages being torched, of course, people being shot, but most death occur in the Great Syrian Desert, where the conditions of life do not exist, where the relationship again between space and life is one calculated to become this Todesraum rather than the Lebensraum that they may have had where they were in the places where they were expelled from. Think about the destruction of the Over Herero. No? So in August 1904, the German imperial forces are kind of putting under siege the Over Hereros under the Waterberg, this biggest water body. Waterberg, as its name suggests, is a water mountain. And where the majority of the Hereros were kind of existing in a sort of and using this area for pastoral for the cattle, and putting a siege around the Waterberg, leaving only the eastern side open, and pushing the Hereros into the Kalahari Desert, where the majority are destroyed. What you have in a Holocaust is, the Holocaust it has a very complicated, multi-layered history, because the relationship between, let's say, Christian anti-Semitism and the Jewish communities in Europe cannot be reduced to settler colonial logic, but there is a settler colonial logic to the German occupation in the East during the Second World War. I mean, it's a classic settler colonial project. What is what they've activated is something that they called Generalplan Ost, the general plan for the East, in which Slavic people would be displaced or enslaved, in which their villages and city would be destroyed or occupied by Germans, and Germans who live in much higher density, let's say in a core of pre-World War II Germany, would actually expand and populate the East, pushing the population further and further to the east there. So you have a settler colonial project happening on European soil after Germany loses its colonial empire, or whatever. Maybe it's not an empire. It's nothing like the French or the British one, or even the Dutch one. But it's not only Namibia, it's Tanzania, it's Togo, it's other colonies that they do lose in the First World War, mainly to the British, and actually try to rebuild the colonial project in the East. And there's a long history of German colonization and Prussian particular colonization of the East. What they're after are the Great Plains of Ukraine, the same areas where now Russian and Ukrainians are fighting, which has a uniquely rich soil and uniquely rich weather for agriculture. And this is known as the breadbasket of Europe, the most fertile part of Europe. So this is what they try to do on the way. So that settler colonial project, the German settler colonial project during the Second World War, encounter modernity, encounter the sort of classic anti-Semitism and other functions, and within it there is a certain modernization of the calculus that come to destroy not only the Jews, Roma people, and others. As they move further and further east. These are, in Timothy Snyder's word, these are the bloodlands, where it happened. So you have a kind of a genocide that also happened within the shadow of a classic settler colonial project. So I think settler colonization is really an interesting framework. In and around Gaza, the area is considered the breadbasket of Palestine. Is it like the Ukraine? Not exactly, but it's in relation to that. Wadi Gaza, the kind of the aquatic system that is east of the Gaza Strip, as before 1948, being the site where Palestinian, mainly Bedouin Palestinians, are cultivating wheat and barley for export. It's an extremely rich agricultural zone, and from there they're expelled into the desert. During 48, into the sand dunes, into Gaza. Israel is trying to push them in the last battle of the war part of the 1948 Nakba, the last skirmishes with Egypt. Actually, Israel is invading Egypt, trying to collapse the supply line and push all Palestinians into the Egyptian desert and out of Palestine. By the way, Palestine is in its kind of sense, in the sense that it had to not only the indigenous population, but to biblical scholars of the 19th century and to Zionists, is a site that is environmentally conceived. It's the edge of the desert. It's what lies beyond the desert. With all the biblical myth of having exited through the desert and enter the Holy Land. And the site where that happens, the site of environmental transition from the desert to the zone is the area in and around Gaza, is this southwestern coast of Palestine. And indeed, in many historical period, it was Wadi Gaza that was the edge, the line that for the kind of 19th century Zionists, from the 19th century Zionists, both Christians and Jewish, were conceiving Wadi Gaza as the threshold of the desert, as the edge of Palestine. And this is the line south of which Israel is ordering all Palestinians at the beginning of the genocide. And when the genocide became clear on the 13th of October 2023, where it gives Palestinian 24 hours to leave their city, to leave Gaza City, and everything over, sort of the area north of Wadi Gaza in the Gaza Strip is kind of like a third of its size, but it's the business area, it's the fertile area. You have most agriculture in the area of Bet Hanun and Bet Lahya and Jabalia. This is the kind of the breadbasket, the part of the breadbasket that has remained within the borders of the Gaza Strip. And on the 13th of October, Israel is expelling Palestinian, or ordering all Palestinians to expel south of Wadi Gaza into what they conceive to be the desert part of the Strip. And from there, hoping that the border to Egypt would collapse and they would be sent into the desert. So you see, you have here kind of like settler colonial projects are all different, but they speak a similar idiom. The desert, the sun, the environment is conceived as a mechanism both of life enhancement and life destruction.
We will run through the process of the genocide in Gaza, but I also want to go back to something you sort of brushed over a moment ago, which is the ways in which the Gaza Strip was actually made as an environment itself. Why is there this more or less arbitrary demarcation? Why is, as you're saying, more than half of it actually, south of the Wadi Gaza, south of the line that demarcates the end of the beginning of the desert? Why is half of the Gaza Strip in an area that is broadly considered to be uninhabitable? What is the historical process there that's happened that means that we have a Gaza Strip and not a open land where people settle wherever they want?
Yeah, no, I mean, this is so Gaza Strip is actually a colonial designation. I mean, it's never.
Yeah.
There was Ukata Gaza, which is a very large area, part of the Beersheba area of what Israel now calls the northern Negev. No, I mean, the term Negev is coming only with the sort of British and Zionist settlement of the area and invasion into this area. And what is absolutely interesting geographically to understand about that part is Gaza, the town of Gaza at the time, is where the Mediterranean kind of turns, right? When it is, I guess it's like this for if the camera is on. So where the shoreline stops being the kind of the north-south shoreline of the Levant,
yeah,
and it kind of turns with Gaza City as a hinge into the northern coast of Africa, and that turn in the coastline is actually what, to a great extent, in relation to that turn in the coastline, life and death in Gaza is articulated historically, because that turn is what drops radically the amount of rain with every kilometer driving south from Gaza City. There is about 10 millimeter less rain per year, so the desert falls very relatively sharp. That does not mean that there is no agricultural practice, even in the Sinai Desert or even in the south of Gaza. There's the Al-Mawasi system, where indigenous people that lived in the area and later Palestinian Bedouins from this area were cultivating in and amongst dunes. The water level under the sand is quite high, and you can relatively easy have wells in this part. So, for modernists, for colonizers, the threshold of the desert is sharp. There is a line, south of it there is desert, north of it there is no desert. For the people that actually live in a part, there's a much kind of like slower trajectory of in which different forms of life are kind of like changing much slower. But the people who actually started mapping Palestine, and the earliest Zionists, in fact, were not Jews. They were, as it is very well known, those travelers and spies and cartographers and soldiers that were biblical scholars that were entering, that Edward Said is speaking about very much in Orientalism. They're traveling through Palestine. Usually they come, the trip looks like that. You come with a boat to Alexandria or Port Said, and then you go along the coast and you would enter, and most of them are entering Palestine in Gaza. That was also the direction from which the Napoleonic army is actually invading that part at the end of the 19th century, and with their cartographers, etc. And in almost all descriptions that I've read of that pathway, they talk about the desert, they talk about the, in anticipation of entering Palestine, and then it's almost kind of like a biblical miracle. They cross Wadi Gaza, and then the desert gives way to colorful and green plains. Some people say it looks like the south of France, other like Tuscany, other it's like for whatever environment you come from, that is your image. And Zionists also carried with them that kind of theological, environmental, meteorological line, that's kind of threshold of the desert. That after the First World War, after Palestine is occupied, and indeed, just before that, the Ottoman Empire also understand that conception, that European conception. And they fortified the southern border of Palestine against the British invasion, which comes along the same path of all those travelers and spies and cartographers, along Wadi Gaza and the threshold of the desert. Their calculus is simple. They just want the invading Europeans to actually dry out in the desert before they are entering into Palestine. So the most formidable Ottoman line of fortification is along the Wadi Gaza area. And the British Expeditionary Force of the First World War indeed got stuck there for months. They cannot break through. They're losing soldiers, and only at the end of that battle, really a couple of days, in the last days of October 1917, they actually make a divergence attack. They ride their forces, or some Australian cavaliers are riding in Wadi Gaza, hidden from Ottoman soldiers, into Beersheba, and they break through Beersheba rather than in Gaza, where they got stuck. And then when they break through Wadi Gaza, they break into kind of Palestine as they conceive it. They have, the roads to Jerusalem is open, and therefore, so you have a lot of kind of military history that is aligned along that kind of threshold of the desert, etc. And there is another interesting geological kind of feature to this area that anyone from the region knows extremely well. That the sand dunes, which is basically kind of like crushed rock from Eastern Africa, traveling down the Nile, piling onto the coast of Palestine. The dunes move eastwards in the same way like the waves moving to the coast. And then you have a kind of like almost like a car crash, because every winter when the dunes are moving towards the east, they meet mud flowing towards the west, draining from the Hebron mountain. And those two massive movements of soil crash around where's now the middle of the Gaza Strip, where the most ancient road in history is kind of like lying and skirting that edge between dune and sand. Sorry, between sand and clay. And these soils are also interlaced under the surface. So over the surface you have a point where they meet, and under the surface they have like a layer of clay, and layer of sand, a layer of clay, a layer of sand, which becomes also determinant of the genocide, as we'll speak about later. So so Gaza is always at the threshold between kind of life and death, between sand and soil, right? Between incredibly fertile soil in its eastern part and kind of, very difficult soil, sand to cultivate on the western part, between a relatively rainy north and a very arid south of the Gaza Strip. And all these conditions are weaponized. So what we see now, and this is where we started, throughout the genocide, Israel tried to push Palestinians from the north to the south and always from the east to the west, i.e. from those kind of conditions of life, environmental conditions of life, towards those environmental conditions of death, with the intention of pushing them even further. So this is what I mean, that you need to kind of like understand the architecture of the earth, if you like, this kind of geological, some people call it like the Anthropocene, no? This sort of like the way in which geology and human inhabitation interact, in order to understand the sort of the environment conceived as a machinic kind of architecture that is snapped and turned into a death trap for Palestinians.
People will be familiar, I think, with the fact that the Caterpillar Inc., which is a global construction company, is on the BDS list, the Boycott, Divest and Sanctions list, and relatively prominently on that list as a target. They make bulldozers and so on. But I think in your telling, it really becomes extremely obvious why Caterpillar would be such an important target for the BDS movement, because of this environmental project, this earth-moving project, both at the very, very beginning of the sort of the occupation of Palestine, with the construction of the Gaza Strip in this act of ploughing the line that goes around, that forms the Gaza Strip, and with the Caterpillar D6 bulldozer, which is the image you open the book with, that the whole thing sort of begins with this like architectural or sort of land moving process. And then of course we get up to the present day, and there is still a great deal of continuity there. There is still not now the D6, but the D9 bulldozer. Can you tell us about what continuities there are between this initiatory act in the Nakba of the formation of the Gaza Strip as a zone of refuge, but also a zone of constraint and containment, and the present process that you describe in your book as ungrounding?
Yeah,
what continuities can we see across that whole arc?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's a really nice insight that to say that and horrific as such, that if colonialism is an earth-shaping project, if colonialism is an environmental project, the main instrument for it is the bulldozer, because the bulldozer is conducting not only demolition of home, but terraforming. No, I mean, it is taking soil from one place to the other. It is shaping soil into mountains. It is plowing those caterpillars that we're using at the wake of the 48 war. So into this kind of fragile environmental zone is now conceived as the Gaza Strip. That is to say, the Gaza Strip is a kind of a line that was drawn by a deep plow, at the wake of the 48 war, so early in 1949, and in 1950, the bulldozers are stabbing like a really deep plow. This is not plow for planting or sowing. This is what's called a ripper plow into the ground, and drawing on the earth, turning the earth into a drawing, making a line in the sand, if you like, around those this strip. The last toehold in Palestine, this is just over 1% of the size of historic Palestine, into which 200,000 Palestinian refugees from the entire area of Palestine, south of Jaffa and east of Gaza, are being crowded into it. About half of them are farmers from the coastal plain in the north, and about half, just under, Bedouin Palestinians from the Wadi Gaza areas. These are mainly farmers that are ending there, although some people from Jaffa and Haifa also end up in Gaza.
This fact that these are farmers and that the Bedouin are capable of living under conditions we would regard as very difficult to live in, because you don't have the techniques, you don't have the knowledge that they have, really gives the lie to the sort of foundational ecological myth of Israel, which is that it made the desert bloom, and that before before the Nakba, there was essentially nothing, scrubland, processed. I think that's that kind of the way in which that ecological logic plays into this is incredibly important to sort of understand as a continuity.
No, absolutely.
Sorry.
And the cultivation in the Wadi Gaza basin, which is the larger kind of water basin in southern Palestine, is producing not only enough wheat and barley for Palestine itself, but it goes huge amount of it is export, including during the later part of the 19th century into Britain. And indeed, when the kind of the institution of the pub is being kind of established in Industrial Revolution Britain, to also as a way of, you say it, but as a way of kind of like creating the docile labor force for the Industrial Revolution through kind of fragments of entertainment that is being offered there. They require enormous amount of barley, that beer in breweries in Liverpool, and enormous amount of the barley is actually being exported to Britain from Ottoman Palestine into Britain. So those farmers are enormously productive, and it's only collapsing the barley sort of cultivation in and around Gaza is collapsing only during the time of the Prohibition in the US in the 1920s, when actually there is all this barley in the Mojave Desert, California and other, is being kind of flooding the market because there is no beer cultivation in the or beer production in the US. And then the area kind of like is slightly impoverished, and its resilience, it's never recovered, in fact. And it's part of the reason that it was easier for the Zionists to break Palestinian society there, was that. But I needed to really understand what does it mean to, because if you think about cultivation at the threshold of the desert, in the last riverbed of Palestine, before the Sinai Desert, the life that was there, the lived world that was there, I had no better guide than in the great Palestinian cartographer and writer, historian, Salman Abu Sitta, who actually, the Abu Sitta family, absolutely, here's Salman. I love Salman. He's kind of like my alter ego in this book. And indeed, speaking with the moral force of a refugee and with the eye of an engineer over the details of life in Al-Ma'in, which is the village where his family, called Ma'in Abu Sitta, and on many other. I mean, we've collaborated before for about a decade, and together with Salman, we've started a project during the Gaza genocide. He was actually kind of quite worried that it would take our attention away from mapping the genocide, but we understood that the magnitude of that event required a kind of like a historical perspective, required the construction of historical consciousness. We need to know who those refugees in Gaza are and where they came from. And there was no better way to do it on Ma'in Abu Sitta in a very detailed architectural reconstruction of the system of cultivation there, of barley, wheat, fallowing, all this incredible wealth of indigenous knowledge and agricultural cultivations. We also had the help of Muhammad Abu Jayyab, a Palestinian, kind of like farmer that is, kind of very knowledgeable indigenous cultivation. So we did an enormous amount of work on understanding that village, and through that process of modeling, which for us is also a mnemonic device. No? So while you model the territory, you can, the model allows you to recall other details. So the actual, again, it's a relation between, as an architect, it's always a relation between space and death in genocide. Here is a relation between space, architecture, and memory, and a kind of a memory as resistance. And even when we were reading aerial and satellite images of this area, we wanted to read them from the bottom up, i.e., from an understanding of where Bali is, how does it feel, what's the relation in Bali and the family compounds and the roots and all the agricultural system and the wells, the really deepest wells in Palestine that were dug by those Palestinian Bedouin communities, some of them called Tarabin well. I mean, also the Abu Sittas are members of the Tarabin tribe, the largest in the area, and there is a term, Tarabin well, which is kind of like unique in being very narrow and very deep. Incredible feat of architectural construction to dig 100-meter deep wells, because that's the depth of water in this area, which are also, and we can talk about it later, the beginning of the knowledge that was required for building the tunnel network that was a means of opening the trade routes cut by the occupation and the siege that Gaza was put under. So yes, and then Al Ma'in, after it's occupied and depopulated on the eve of Israel's declaration of independence, it is being plowed over by Caterpillar D6. And the plows are the means of rubbing and erasure. So when you speak about Zionism and agriculture and all the means of making the desert bloom, in fact, what's under the teeth of these plows are the roots, the cemeteries, the homes, the traces of Palestinian life. There is nothing better than a plow to actually churn the earth around, and the plows are used as rubbering, as kind of rubber erasures of the landscape. And what the agricultural plows did during and after 1948, the huge D10, D9 caterpillars, those monsters are doing in Gaza. They're not plowing the ground, they are just flipping it over. They're not simply destroying. That is the kind of the notion of ungrounding, is this sort of terraforming, earth-shaping, environmental destroying force of settler colonial war and the settler colonial genocide at the time. That is to say, they are not simply destroying the home, they're taking them from their foundation and turning them over, effectively the invasion as a force of desertification. They are desertifying Gaza from the fences inwards. There is nothing to speak about, destruction as a consequence of resistance or skirmishes with a resistance in Gaza, because then you would expect to see destruction being haphazard, happening here or there, wherever, this is how the battlefield looked like. It looks like a random space, more or less. But you see basically there's a tide of desertification flowing from the outside in shaving all orchards, flipping all fields, destroying all homes, tearing through sewage system and everything, and making everything that bloom into a desert.
I want to talk about one particular moment of that, because you have a recent report that I think is really important for people to be able to see. This scene here is an area of Rafah, which you've done a report into, just to kind of have a sense of how this process is continuing even through the ceasefire. You can see up here in the top left that this is 18th of March. So that's the end, towards the end of the first ceasefire that was organized between January and March 2025. The area you can see is relatively intact. There are greenhouses that are marked. Greenhouses, incredibly important part of the Gaza agricultural system. What function do they play?
Yeah, greenhouses are a way of enhancing agricultural production, obviously, in kind of a controlled environment. I mean, the modernization of agriculture did not pass over Gaza. I mean, Gaza now, because of the small amount of agricultural land there, in order to feed itself, it needs to amplify agricultural production. So greenhouses are kind of like everywhere in the in the fringes of the built-up area, mainly towards the defenses with Israel.
Yeah. If you look through the pictures of Gaza, even now, you can see there are still some greenhouses, nowhere near enough, of course, to be autonomous of food production, nowhere near, but there are still greenhouses. This is then this environment, and we can see very clearly what I think this is what you mean by ungrounding.
Yeah.
We can see this process of the structures being destroyed and the land partially cleared. All the greenhouses are now gone, people who are just listening to this. And we have an Israeli military outpost along the Morag corridor. This is one of several corridors that is constructed, which is based on the names of the previous settlements that were put into Gaza, the Five Fingers Plan under Sharon. And this is the most famous one of these is the Netzahim corridor, which is a corridor in the top area of Gaza in the north. And then by December, you can see that there is. I mean, you taught me through this. You're the expert. You're the person who put this together. Tell us what we're seeing here.
So what you see is simultaneously a process of destruction and construction. So people say, okay, Gaza is a field of ruin. Indeed, everything along the area that is now in Israel's hand, and indeed, during the ceasefire, that earthwork is continuously being made, so much so that Israel is running out of bulldozers and had to privatize the acts of destruction.
Yep.
But it's not only a demolition zone, it's also a construction site, because the earth that is, and this is what you've seen, no? You see it shave everything. Bulldozers go and actually they shave the field, they flip it over, and then they pile it into a landscape of hills. So if you see the Morag corridor here in the kind of like top right.
This area here, yeah.
Yeah. Effectively, what it is, and what you see in the satellite image, these are huge earth berms. These are mound of soil and rubble. Everything that Palestinian life was. It has some crushed concrete and plaster and some soil and some dead plants. And indeed, in some places, because families are left during that destruction, when Israel bombed buildings, those homes are mass graves, no? I mean, for entire families that could not be extracted. Sometimes that rubble, which contains human remain, is being reused. So we're talking about really a devilish kind of soil that is being shaped. And here along the Morad corridor, you have two berms protecting it, because the way that the Israeli military enters and invades, it is not just invades, it shapes the area as it invades. It protects itself by piling the rubble of Palestinian life into an architecture of earth berms. So everything that they build, quote unquote, build in Gaza is terraforming, is shaping off the ground. There might be clearer example. I don't know if in this one or in other studies. Yes, you see. So if you drill into the Israeli military outpost, you see that inside this red zone, these are also constructed from earth enclosures. So bulldozers are extremely busy in reshaping the landscape, building detention facilities, torture facilities, Israeli military bases, earth berms, outposts. Everything is built out of earth. Here, you can see it on the left hand side, the small square, etc. But I can give you more images of that to actually use in the edit, if you like, Richard. But yes, so effectively, and what you see in the top left of that image is the beginning of the dune area of Gaza. No, so you have here is exactly what I was talking about: the area where dunes meet agricultural zone. All the former agricultural zone is shaven and shaped into artificial dunes, and Palestinians are being pushed onto the dune area.
I want to go back to another act of ungrounding, because I think it's actually really shocking in one particular detail. The entire thing is shocking, in fact, which is the massacre of aid workers that took place in March 2025. And in your report on this, which you can see a sort of screenshot from here, you note that after the massacre has taken place, the Israeli military then comes and restructures the environment such that the memories that the survivors of this massacre have no longer correspond to the environment in which the massacre happened. And this is what you describe as the sort of the erasure of the erasure. So Palestinian culture is erased, Palestinian lives are erased. And then there is this process whereby even the fact of that erasure is reconstructed in such a way as to make it impossible to remember, to understand, to make coherent sense of. I wonder if you could talk to that kind of broader process and how this particular investigation of the massacre of these aid workers happened.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think at start I was just introducing the fact, because we spoke about situated testimony, and situated testimony is really the relation between space and memory. No, I mean we all know that when you go to a place that you've been in, maybe, and you experience something in it, as you walk through a particular building, you start recalling details that are otherwise not available to you, etc. So this is we enhance that process through the process of recollection through modeling. One of the most horrific form of torture that the book documents is Palestinians, usually young men, captured in their neighborhood, say Jabalia or Han Yunis or Rafah, and they're taken somewhere, blindfolded, they're tortured. Then the area is, in the meantime, being transformed. They're being brought into this place. They're being whatever is hiding their eyesight is being removed, and they are told, "This, you're standing now where your home once stood." And many Palestinians we spoke to talk about that as the most unsettling experience. Some felt hysterical from that, because it de-anchors, it ungrounds, and ungrounding is also grounding is also an emotional relation to place where society is actually built, even if it is within the refugee camp that the Gaza Strip is, this open space prison. There's still life that was there. No, there's memories there, and the total erasure. Where would we meet? No, there is no place to actually anchor recollection. Is undertaken, and this is like this architectural variation of dysmorphia. Dysmorphia is what First World War soldiers experienced. Were coming back from the front, not recognizing themselves in a mirror when the face was disfigured, and that recognition of self and the memory and the subjectivity that you have is the anchor around which society and your sense of society and space is being built. Without that, it kind of breaks society. Society is broken without the relation to the space that holds its memory. So this is really what we documented and experienced through two survivors of the massacre that happened at the end of March 2025. The beginning of Israel violates a ceasefire. And one of the first mass atrocities it's committing is ambushing a convoy of ambulances and other first responder vehicles, massacring those workers, unarmed, clearly marked medics, shooting them, as we have discovered through the investigation, at point blank, executing them, just literally standing above them and shooting them, and then burying the bodies and the vehicles under earth, right? So the earth here becomes a mode of negation, right? Changing the earth is breaking the memory, the relation between society and space, raising that, what I call in the book, the earth storm. Earth waves kind of like crash over those bodies and vehicles, becomes a means of genocide denial, of trying to hide one of the most kind of well-known, but there are many of such atrocities throughout the genocide in there. So there is a new landscape that is being created. And indeed, through that process of situated testimony, we try to kind of resist it. to anchor memory back into space that doesn't exist. So you cannot go to that place and say, and somebody would show you what happened, because the place where the massacres happened no longer exists. It used to be relatively flat. Now it's hilly. There are massive earth berms in it. Any anchor to memory, any piece of asphalt or any piece of buildings or structure or field that was next to it, it's erased. So you need to do it in the computer. And my team was doing we had a collaboration. The investigation was done together with the Red Crescent in Gaza, and the two survivors of the massacre were actually speaking to us over the internet. We were sharing the model, we were changing the model with them in order to actually make sense of this, the flat sea, if you like, before the massacre and the storm that came after it in terms of the earth being completely reshaped. And then not only, and we don't understand why, what is the context of this thing happening at this moment, until we understood that it is on the site where that massacre happened, that earth that rose and buried that vehicle, not only tried to deny and hide that crime, but that very soil was later reshaped into one of those horrible feeding stations that Israel constructed in the summer of 2025, channeling enormous amount of starved Palestinians into it and sniping at them, murdering so many of them as they were starved people were going to seek for food. So it created that one of those kind of mechanism of destruction. Indeed, again, through starvation and providing meager amount of food in the south of the Gaza Strip, Israel tried to continue that sort of population transfer, this expulsion, the transfer of people from the north to the south. And later, after the ceasefire of October 2025, that very same earth was later reshaped into the biggest earth berm that was constructed within Gaza, and that is what is called the yellow line, the area that divides the zone now permanently occupied by Israel and the shrinking concentration camp of Palestinians along the coast. So all that story could be understood if you understand the earth itself as a kind of plastic, elastic medium that is an actor. The earth is not simply the backdrop against which things happen. The earth and its shaping is the mechanism by which this genocide is perpetrated. And that is, if you like, that's the single most important thing that the book is trying to show, is because it covers a 100 years history from the 1920s to the 2020s. It is a story of the way in which Zionist settler colonization has reshaped the soil of Palestine in this part, turned the environment into a weapon and into a Todesraum, into a death space for Palestinians.
And at the same time, there is a counter-project to this that has been going on. The most infamous, perhaps the most famous, the most sort of striking aspect of which is the construction of tunnels. And this is a whole section of the book. It's an excellent section of the book. People should go and read this. We've been talking about Ungrounding, the Architecture of Genocide. There is a lot of propaganda about the tunnels. There is a lot of ideas about what Hamas should have been doing instead of making tunnels, as if there was a kind of straightforward trade-off there. How do you understand what the tunnels are? How do they connect to the long history of making a life through digging wells in Palestine? And how do they become this structure of, maybe I'll just leave the question there, actually.
Yeah, so firstly, I would say the tunnels are a way of turning a death space into a lived environment. It was absolutely essential. It is a kind of also a way of inhabiting this very complex subterranean environment that I was speaking about before, that layers of the soil, the sand, sandstone, clay, landscape. Imagine under the surface, you have an extremely complex landscape with its hills. These are hills of clay that are in the subsoil, and valleys. You have subterranean rivers and you have subterranean lake. These are the aquifers. You have a subterranean beach, which is the line of the salt water level in there. This is all landscape that is tucked one on top of the other. So it's a landscape that could not be seen. It's a landscape that only could be felt as a texture with the fingers of those brave Palestinians that were digging and inhabiting the subsoil. Now, I have to say that I've had to take an extremely rigid methodological kind of principles in engaging with the subsoil. The subsoil is there because it is not seen. At the subsoil, the construction of the tunnel system was so effective because the overexposed surface of the earth, where it's photographed by drones and satellites and helicopters and people on the ground with the phones, etc., and all that is kind of like an image space. You cross the threshold of the earth down, and there's no signal, there's no image. There is a kind of a darkness, and I wanted to respect that. And my aim as a spatial historian or a spatial researcher with forensic archaeology is definitely not to map out the tunnel system. So all parts of the book include interviews with people who are working in either working the soil, in the kind of the history part, Salman Abu Sitta, etc., and others. During the genocide, there's a lot of interview, including a beautiful and important situated testimony with Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's the nephew of Salman Abu Sitta, on his time during the genocide in Gaza. In the subsoil, I have no interviews with people. I included no interview and no original research. It is a mode of conceptualization. And the story that I'm telling, only from existing sources, is one of which landless farmers, mainly Palestinian Bedouins, that were expelled from the Wadi Gaza basin, with their unique understanding of soil and unique knowledge of digging wells, actually used that and inhabited the subsoil as the only part of Palestine left unoccupied. So in 1967, Israel occupies the Gaza Strip. At that very moment, that chapter begins. With the occupation, Palestinians are actually already going into the subsoil and using indigenous techniques in creating the most incredible architectural project of resistance, I think, of the turn of the 21st century. Before the 20 years into it, 20 years after the turn of the 20th century. The tunnels are means of supply. So Israel, to say Gaza Strip is already to say siege, but in the past 20 years, before October 7th, 2023, Gaza was under a blockade in which, as we spoke, all conditions of life were regulated. The way in which to relieve the effect of that siege with medicine, food, and gas and petrol, electricity was regulated was through opening the most ancient trade route in history, and that is the trade route that connected the Sinai, Egypt, the kingdoms of the Nile and the kingdom of Euphrates, that what's called the Via Maris, that crosses Gaza and got cut by the siege around Gaza. So it got opened like a bypass of a heart attack, in the subsoil. So you have the bypass of the Via Maris going in there, and then the technique becomes more and more sophisticated, and I describe the way it evolves. But I describe it as the result of the knowledge of farmers, landless farmers denied of the land, inhabiting the subsoil, understanding the difference between different soils in the subsoil, knowing and following the clay ridges, sometimes going up with them, because digging through clay is creating a clay vessel. It's the strongest kind of form, avoiding the water table, linking up with each other, not through as a social network. No, I mean, where a tunnel kind of pops up on the surface is with people that you trust. So it's a kind of like an internet, a material sort of like internet, if you like, that happens through the materiality of the environment that is linking Palestinians with those they want to actually link with, and then as it goes further towards the present, the understanding is that the subsoil is a site of fantasy and propaganda. It becomes that. This is not to say there are no military tunnels in Gaza. Obviously, we've seen some of them, and we have. There's cameras have descended into some of them. We know some of the Israeli captives were held in them, etc. But I think that Israel tends to completely exaggerate the tunnel network as a means to unground Gaza. In order to unground, in order to create that total desertification, like Tzipi Hutebali, who claims, and I reproduced this quote in the book, that every school, she says, every school has a tunnel under it. That means every school is a legitimate target. Every mosque has a tunnel under it. That means every mosque needs to be destroyed. The idea of every is what kind of like generates that genocidal, indistinguished kind of like destruction, carpet of destruction, where all conditions of life are actually undertaken. I'm also describing an Israeli experimental technique where they pump water from the Mediterranean and try to flood the tunnels, but actually end up destroying the conditions of life in the subsoil, those, the aquifers on which life depends on that. I mean, if you think about it, what is cultivated on the surface, the wheat, the barley that is kind of like in the first sort of meter and a half above the surface level, depends on dozens of meters of bacteria and worms and moisture and minerals. That is what compose the subsoil. And indeed, the subsoil is almost synonymous with conditions of life. It is the conditions of life on the surface, the soil. There is no agriculture without the subsoil, and there's no life on the planet without the soil. It's a kind of an enormous sort of bioreservoir of life that is being destroyed. And when we return back to where we began, the conditions of life, we should not forget that in the Genocide Convention of 1948, there's the word calculated, conditions of life calculated. That is the kind of the modernist paradigm, where conditions of life are calculated, they're engineered, they are designed as an instrument of siege and death, or as an instrument of enhancing life, as in modern architecture. In any case, the life is entering into a calculus where calories and water and electricity and all those things that people need are kind of like, effectively calculated and calibrated to achieve a particular thing. And a mode of resistance to life calculated is to make yourself incalculable. The mode of resistance to visibility is to make yourself invisible. And I think in a tunnel project, the opacity that Palestinians have taken on while entering into the subsoil has created also, therefore, this extremely effective mode of resistance, and perhaps even the structures from which life in Gaza can actually rebound.
We have so much more to discuss, but we've run out of time. People will be able to have seen the things that appeared on the screen, these various projects that Forensic Architecture has been doing. I very strongly encourage everyone to go and look at these full reports. The ones we didn't get to that we could have spoken about was that situated testimony on the hospital strike that took place in October 2023, much disputed exactly what happened there, but the situation testimony is undeniable, and the Forensic Architecture's own analysis completely disproves the Israeli story there, and that's extremely important because that is a moment at which we move from war to genocide in a very coherent and clear way. There are many, many more things on the website, including architectural analyses of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, aid distribution systems. There are many, many more things in this book. People should definitely go and read it. But if I have one last question, it is simply, you are Forensic Architecture, which is the institute you run at Goldsmiths, has made itself not only a sort of closed, hermetic institution, but now part of what you describe as the investigative commons. The name of this show is Do Your Own Research. What is the one technique you would suggest people familiarize themselves with such that they can do the kind of investigative work that is important to keep the memory and resistance to colonialism alive?
Yeah, architectural technology has evolved in recent decades in an exponential degree, much more than the architectural fact, when buildings have evolved. And so there's a growing delta between what architects can do, what they can model, what they can actually analyze, what they can build in the computer, and what the profession is actually using. And this is the delta that we are mining. And what we would like to maybe end up with, and an appeal to those few architects that may be watching that, is we have incredibly powerful investigative tools. The environment, buildings, cities, the soil, the landscape are not only the sites of war, they are the instruments by which war is waged. We need to understand it. We need to resist it. We need to take and turn architecture as a means of resistance. We need to read the weak signals in the landscape in order to build also, and when we are able to build, the architecture of liberation in Palestine after the return, after reparations have been given, to build an architecture of allow the return of Palestinians to the land, to rebuild that landscape that has been destroyed. We would be able to actually use architecture as also an instrument of liberation. And the techniques that I would be most interested in, when architecture is faced erasure, when erasure is trying to destroy the spirit, the life of a people, the relation between architecture and memory is the one that I would like really to refer to again. Build model of places that have disappeared, walk through them, and you would see how much a place could exist through the memory of the community that inhabited it, and how important that memory is as a means for liberation and return.
Eyal Weizman, thank you for doing your own research.
Thank you.